Your patience is rewarded.
Tonight, 2 planeswalkers have been summoned to fight to the death. Both planeswalkers walk into the arena, but only one leaves with their sparks still ignited. The planeswalkers have chosen a commander to represent them and ensure their ability to lead through the blind eternities. Who will amass the greatest army and devastate the competition? Find out on Commander Duel! WUBRG opens Game 1 casting Soul Ring, tapping it for 2, and casting Skull Clamp. Tyler plays a forest for his turn, and WUBRG plays a mountain and passes. Tyler plays another forest and casts Gyre Sage. WUBRG plays a Desolate Lighthouse as his land, and taps 5 to cast Mind Moil, which will cause him to recycle his hand for every spell he casts. Tyler plays Karn's Bastion as land for turn, and casts Evolution Sage, causing Gyre Sage to evolve. Tyler swings for 2 damage at WUBRG. WUBRG casts Rush of Knowledge, causing Mind Moil to trigger. The ability resolves, and WUBRG puts his hand on the bottom of his library and draws 3 cards. Rush of Knowledge resolves, and he draws an additional 5 cards. He plays Dwarven Mine as land for turn, which enters tapped. Tyler plays a forest, which causes Evolution Sage's ability to trigger, proliferating Gyre Sage. Tyler taps his mana and Gyre Sage to cast Wildwood Scourge for X equals 5, causing Gyre Sage to evolve. He moves to combat and hits WUBRG for 3 damage. WUBRG suspends Wheel of Fate with 4 time counters on it. Tyler plays an island, causing Evolution Sage to trigger. Tyler proliferates Gyre Sage and Wildwood Scourge. Wildwood Scourge gets an additional +1/+1 counter from its ability. Tyler taps for 3 mana and casts Midnight Clock. Tyler uses his last 3 mana to cast Vorel of the Hull Clade, his commander. He turns all of his creatures sideways for 16 damage. During WUBRG's upkeep, Tyler adds a counter to Midnight Clock. WUBRG removes a time counter from Wheel of Fate. He plays his land, Swiftwater Cliffs, and gains 1 life. WUBRG casts Locust God, causing Mind Moil to trigger for 6 cards. With his last mana, he casts Brainstorm, causing Mind Moil to trigger again. WUBRG recycles 5 cards, giving him 5 Locust tokens. Brainstorm then resolves, giving WUBRG an additional 3 Locusts for 8 Locusts total. Tyler takes his turn, adding a counter to Midnight Clock during his upkeep. He plays a land, causing Evolution Sage to trigger. He proliferates on Wildwood Scourge, Gyre Sage, and Midnight Clock. He taps for 5 to cast Seedborn Muse. Tyler swings with his 10/10 Hydra which is blocked by a Locust token. During WUBRG's upkeep, Tyler untaps his permanents and adds a counter to Midnight Clock. WUBRG removes a time counter from Wheel of Fate. When WUBRG draws his card for turn, he creates a Locust token. WUBRG plays Myriad Landscape as land for turn. He casts Kefnet the Mindful, causing Mind Moil to trigger. WUBRG draws 5 cards and creates 5 Locust tokens. Kefnet resolves, and WUBRG casts Throne of the God Pharaoh. Mind Moil triggers, and WUBRG draws 4 cards and creates 4 Locust tokens. The spell resolves, and WUBRG evokes Muldrifter. WUBRG recycles 3 cards, creating 3 Locusts. Muldrifter resolves, and draws an additional 2 cards. WUBRG creates 2 additional Locust tokens. He then must sacrifice Muldrifter. WUBRG attacks with his army of Locusts. Tyler responds by tapping Midnight Clock and Gyre Sage to cast Aetherize, returning all Locusts to WUBRG's hand. Tyler untaps and adds a counter to Midnight Clock. Tyler uses his commander's ability to double the amount of counters on Gyre Sage. This also adds 5 counters to his Wildwood Scourge. He then proliferates using Karn's Bastion to add a counter onto Gyre Sage, Midnight Clock, and 2 more counters on the Hydra. Tyler attacks with the Gyre Sage and Wildwood Scourge. Kefnet cannot block, so WUBRG blocks the Hydra with the Locust God. He takes the damage from Gyre Sage and goes down to 8 life. During Tyler's end step, the Locust God returns to WUBRG's hand. During WUBRG's upkeep, Tyler untaps all permanents he controls and adds a counter to Midnight Clock. WUBRG removes a time counter from Wheel of Fate. Before WUBRG moves to its draw phase, Tyler uses Vorel's ability to double the amount of counters on Midnight Clock. The ability triggers on Midnight Clock, and Tyler shuffles his hand and graveyard into his library and draws 7 cards. WUBRG goes to main phase and attempts to cast the Locust God. Mind Moil triggers, and WUBRG recycles 5 cards. Locust God then resolves. He then casts Everwatching Threshold, triggering Mind Moil. WUBRG recycles 4 cards and creates 4 Locust tokens. Everwatching Threshold resolves, and WUBRG activates Skull Clamp on a Locust, killing the Locust, drawing him 2 cards and creating 2 more Locusts. WUBRG then passes the turn. Tyler plays a Forest, and Evolution Sage triggers. Tyler proliferates, adding 1 counter to Gyre Sage and 2 on his Hydra. Tyler taps Gyre Sage for 12 mana. He uses 6 of it to cast Vorinclex Monstrous Raider. Tyler adds blue to his mana pool to cast Roelesque Apex Hybrid. The Enters the Battlefield trigger adds 2 counters to Vorinclex, which doubles to 4. This also adds 8 counters to Wildwood Scourge. Tyler then proliferates with Karn's Bastion to add 2 counters onto Vorinclex, 2 counters on Gyre Sage, and another 8 counters on Wildwood Scourge. Tyler attacks WUBRG with Vorinclex and Wildwood Scourge. This triggers Ever-Watching Threshold, so WUBRG draws a card and makes a Locust token. WUBRG assigns 5 Locust blocks to Vorinclex and 1 to the Scourge. He takes 7 trample damage and goes down to 1 life. Second main phase, Tyler casts Incubation Druid. During WUBRG's upkeep, Tyler untaps all his permanents. WUBRG removes the final time counter from Wheel of Fate. Each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. WUBRG makes 7 Locust tokens. WUBRG draws for turn and makes another Locust. Tyler proliferates with Karn's Bastion in response to the trigger, adding 2 counters to Vorinclex, Gyre Sage, and 8 counters to Wildwood Scourge. WUBRG puts Molten Psyche on the stack, causing Mind Moil to trigger. He recycles 6 cards and makes 6 more Locusts. Each player shuffles their hand into their library and draws that many cards. WUBRG controls 3 or more artifacts, so Tyler takes 13 damage from the Metalcraft ability on Molten Psyche. WUBRG makes 6 more Locusts. WUBRG casts Rogue's Glove, which triggers Mind Moil. He recycles 5 cards and makes 5 more Locust tokens. WUBRG plays a land, then casts Winged Words. This triggers Mind Moil, recycling 4 cards and making 4 Locusts. Winged Words resolves, drawing WUBRG 2 more cards and creating 2 more Locusts. WUBRG casts Faithless Looting, triggering Mind Moil for 5, creating 5 more Locusts. Faithless Looting resolves, drawing WUBRG 2 cards and making him discard 2 cards. He makes 2 additional Locusts. WUBRG then casts Repeal for X equals 3, targeting Gyre Sage. Mind Moil triggers, recycling 5 cards and making 5 Locust tokens. Repeal resolves, drawing WUBRG another card and creating another Locust. WUBRG swings with all his haste Locust tokens, killing Tyler and taking Game 1. In Game 2, both players play a land for their first turn. Tyler plays another land on turn 2, but at the end of his turn, WUBRG cycles a card to draw. WUBRG plays a mountain and casts Improbable Alliance. Tyler plays a Karn's Bastion and casts Shapers of Nature. WUBRG plays a Reliquary Tower, then casts Izzet Locket. Tyler plays a land for his turn, then uses 4 mana to activate Shapers of Nature's ability, adding a +1/+1 counter to it. He then swings at WUBRG for 4 damage. WUBRG casts Gutter Snipe on his turn. He then plays a mountain and casts Faithless Looting, dealing 2 damage to Tyler from Gutter Snipe's ability, and creating a fairy token from Improbable Alliance. WUBRG draws 2 cards and discards 2 cards. Tyler casts Evolution Sage on his turn. He follows up by playing Thornwood Falls as his land, gaining him a life. Finally, he proliferates thanks to Evolution Sage's ability. He attacks with a 5/5 and WUBRG blocks with a fairy. WUBRG plays a land and casts his commander, the Locust God. Tyler takes his turn casting Bread for the Hunt. He attacks WUBRG for 5 damage and draws a card from Bread for the Hunt's ability. WUBRG draws a card and creates a Locust on his draw phase. WUBRG then casts Repeal for X equals 3. On cast, Gutter Snipe deals 2 damage to Tyler. Repeal returns Shapers of Nature to Tyler's hand, drawing WUBRG a card and creating a Locust and a Fairy token. WUBRG then casts Witching Well to scry 2. He moves to combat and attacks with his Haste Locust tokens. Tyler untaps and casts Merfolk Sky Scout and passes. WUBRG makes an additional Locust on his draw step. On his main phase, he sacrifices Witching Well to draw 2 cards, making a Fairy and 2 Locust tokens. WUBRG taps for 3 and casts Laboratory Maniac. WUBRG swings with 5 Locust tokens. Tyler blocks one of them and takes 4 damage. Tyler casts Colonian Hydra on his turn, but once again passes. WUBRG makes an additional Locust on his draw step. He taps 4 mana to cast Commit. Gutter Snipe deals 2 damage to Tyler. Commit targets the Hydra, putting Colonian Hydra second from the top of Tyler's library. WUBRG activates the Locust God's ability to draw and discard a card. He creates another Locust token and a Fairy token. Tyler taps for Simic on his turn and casts Simic Ascendancy. Tyler activates the ability of Simic Ascendancy, putting a counter on Merfolk Sky Scout and 1 counter on Simic Ascendancy. Tyler passes and WUBRG untaps and also passes. Tyler untaps and casts Colonian Hydra, adding 4 more counters to Simic Ascendancy. Tyler attacks with the Merfolk Sky Scout. WUBRG takes the damage, but Tyler draws a card thanks to Bread for the Hunt. WUBRG creates another Locust on his draw phase. He activates the ability of Improbable Alliance to draw and discard, creating another Locust and a Fairy token, but passes his turn after that. Tyler takes his turn to cast Deep Glow Skate, doubling the counters on Colonian Hydra, Merfolk Sky Scout, and Simic Ascendancy. He then adds the counters to Simic Ascendancy equal to the amount of counters he added to his creatures. He displays that when he attacks with Colonian Hydra, he will double the counters on his creatures again, adding more counters to Simic Ascendancy, and well over the 20 counters required to win on his upkeep. WUBRG takes the 16 damage and proceeds to take his turn. WUBRG makes a Locust on his draw step. He plays a land and activates the Locust God's ability to draw and discard a card. He discards Echo of Eons. He makes another Locust token and a fairy. He continues to dig through his deck by casting Desperate Ravings. Tyler takes 2 damage from Gutter Snipe. WUBRG creates 2 more Locusts. WUBRG casts Echo of Eons using Flashback to draw 7 more cards and create 7 more Locusts. Gutter Snipe deals an additional 2 damage on cast. WUBRG swings down with his army and hopes Tyler misjudges a block. Tyler blocks the 3 biggest attackers and takes 22 damage, but he remains alive. Tyler takes his turn, and on upkeep, Simic Ascendancy wins him the game. On to game 3. WUBRG opens Game 3 with an island and Enclave Cryptologist. Tyler plays a forest and passes. WUBRG plays Swiftwater Cliff, gaining him a life. Tyler plays a forest and casts Power Conduit. WUBRG uses his mana to level up Enclave Cryptologist. He plays Izzet Boilerworks as land for turn, returning an island to his hand. Tyler plays an island. He taps 2 mana to cast Aphedo Alchemist. WUBRG taps 4 mana to level up Enclave Cryptologist twice. He then taps the creature to draw a card with its ability. Tyler plays another island and casts Nadir Kraken. WUBRG untaps and uses the Enclave Cryptologist to draw a card. He plays a Mystic Sanctuary tapped. He taps 2 mana to suspend Wheel of Fate. WUBRG uses his remaining mana to cast Throne of the God Pharaoh. Tyler loses 1 life from Throne of the God Pharaoh's ability on end step. Tyler pays 1 during his draw step to add a counter to Nadir Kraken and creating a 1/1 tentacle token. Tyler plays Blast Zone as his land for turn. He uses his 4 open mana to cast Explosive Vegetation, putting a forest and island into play tapped. He then attacks WUBRG for 4 damage. During WUBRG's upkeep, a time counter is removed from Wheel of Fate. WUBRG uses the Cryptologist ability to draw a card. WUBRG then casts Winged Words. He moves to end step and Tyler loses another life. WUBRG must discard 2 cards. Tyler pays 1 for Nadir Kraken on his draw, adding a counter to the creature and creating another 1/1 tentacle creature token. During his main phase, he casts Jace Ingenious Mind Mage. Tyler attacks WUBRG for 5 damage. Second main phase, Tyler activates Jace's +1 ability to untap all of his creatures. WUBRG removes a time counter from Wheel of Fate during his upkeep. WUBRG casts Soul Ring and taps the Cryptologist to draw a card. WUBRG taps for 6 mana to cast the Locust God. He moves to end step and Tyler loses 1 life from the Throne of the God Pharaoh. On his draw step, Tyler pays 1 for the Nadir Kraken. He moves to main phase and uses Jace's +1 ability to draw a card, again paying for the Nadir Kraken trigger. Tyler casts Incubation Druid. He then casts Vorel of the Hull Clade. Tyler taps Power Conduit to remove a counter from Nadir Kraken and adding the counter to Incubation Druid. Tyler attacks with 5 damage at WUBRG. On his end step, Tyler taps the Aphedo Alchemist to untap his Nadir Kraken. WUBRG removes the time counter from Wheel of Fate. On his draw, he creates a 1/1 Locust token. WUBRG taps for 5 mana. He then plays his land for turn, Dwarven Mine, which enters tapped. WUBRG casts Reforge the Soul, and both players discard their hands and draw 7 cards. WUBRG makes 7 Locust tokens. WUBRG casts Faithless Looting to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. He creates 2 additional Locusts. WUBRG taps the Cryptologist to draw a card and create another Locust. He moves to attacks and hits Jace for 7 damage with 7 Locusts. WUBRG moves to end step, and Tyler loses 8 life from Throne of the God Pharaoh. Tyler pays 1 for Nadir Kraken to add a counter and create a tentacle token. Tyler taps Incubation Druid for mana. He then taps 3 more mana to cast Vorinclex Monstrous Raider. He taps Power Conduit to remove a counter from his Kraken and putting a counter onto Vorinclex, which doubles to 2 counters. Tyler taps Aphedo Alchemist to untap Incubation Druid. He taps 3 mana to cast Sword of Truth and Justice. Tyler taps Incubation Druid and uses the mana to equip Vorinclex with his sword. Tyler attacks WUBRG for 10 damage. WUBRG cannot block due to the sword's protection from blue. Sword of Truth and Justice triggers, and Tyler adds 2 more counters to Vorinclex, then proliferates all of his counters, adding 2 more to each creature and Blast Zone. WUBRG begins his turn removing the last counter from Wheel of Fate. Both players discard their hand and draw 7 cards. WUBRG makes 7 locusts from the wheel and 1 additional locust from his draw step. WUBRG casts Torbrand, and since his locusts are red and blue, they would deal an extra 2 damage each. Tyler concedes, and the Locust God has taken this commander duel best 2 out of 3.